my name is Kendra, and this is the Master's Literary Projects Workshop. This was begun for summer 2014, but most of the themes and the topics that we'll go over will be applicable to all terms of Master's Lit. So we are going to start by doing a general overview of the program, go through the objectives. Then we'll get into the methodology of the program. We'll go through each of the hours of the class, along with tips and resources for each of those hours. After that, we'll talk a little bit about the final project, and then lastly, we'll go over the online component for the class. So the program objectives for Master's Literature are for students to analyze and comprehend deeper pieces of literature. We're not just going to be looking at the topic, main idea, and details in this class. We're going to be looking at more of the literary elements that are present, the motives of the author, how they feel about the different things that are happening in the text, and analysis. We will also work on, this class is made to help them build that background knowledge that they'll need if they plan on studying abroad or going to an international school. These are the books that will be referenced often, and it helps your students to have that background knowledge to be able to use these works as reference in other stories or other essays that they'll need to write. And lastly, all of the books and plays that we cover in the class are award-winning. They're very significant stories. They cover significant historical events, so all of this will help them also. The class structure is basically broken down like this. This would be for level 1 and level 2, pretty much the same. Hour 1, we start with a homework check, after which there will be a review quiz. This will come from their homework reading. Then there will be either a supplementary reading or a literary lesson. This will switch off between the weeks. Hour 2 is always close reading and discussion of whatever story or novel we're talking about in class. Hour 3 will switch off between critical thinking exercise or an in-class writing. And again, this depends on the week. On even weeks, we will have in-class writing. On odd weeks, we'll have critical thinking exercise, which is meant to prepare them for their online writing, if they're doing that. Some weeks, we will also have a debate, depending on the level of the class. In hour 1, you start with a homework check. The students will always have assigned reading for homework. There are questions that go along with the reading. The questions either will be included on the FTP, or occasionally they will have a workbook that the students have for the class. They complete the questions. You need to check them for completion. This is also where I like to go through and see questions that students struggled with. Obviously, if all of my students missed a question, then I make a note of that so that we can review that question together. During this time, so that my students aren't just sitting, I usually like to give them a quick write. I do this one of two ways. There are many websites online, resources that you can use to find quick write topics. Sometimes I'll just ask them something about life. Usually I'll connect it to a theme from the story that we're going over. Or if there was something that I found particularly interesting in the homework reading, I might pull out a question from there, pull out a quote from the reading. I give my students about 10 minutes to write in the beginning of class while I'm checking off their homework. Then we have a short discussion about this. After the quick write and homework check, there is review quiz. This is also printed off the FTP. In the review quiz, there will be 2 different types of questions most of the time. Usually it is some sort of fill in the blank with important quotes from the story. They will also ask general comprehension questions. This is why the homework questions are very important, because the review quiz will always relate to those questions. Towards the end of the quiz, there will be a quote section normally that asks them the context of the quote and also the significance of that quote. Make sure you preview this with your students. I always let them know the week before, because it's difficult for them to differentiate sometimes between just the context and why is this quote important to the whole story. Okay, lastly, for the review quiz, you have some options. In my class, sometimes if the reading is very difficult, we will break up the quiz. Half of the class will do half the quiz, the other half of the class will do the second half of the quiz, and then they teach each other. Or I might have them do something extra for their homework that I bring into the quiz. You do have some options when it comes to this review quiz for your students. The grade for this will also go into the ERP. Lastly, in the first hour, we will switch off between supplementary reading and or literary lesson. The supplementary reading will always be included on the FTP or in their workbook again. Sometimes the supplementary reading has been a struggle for my students. If I notice that there is a problem with the supplementary reading or I don't think that my students are going to understand it, you have options for this also. I have a website listed up here, eastoftheweb.com/short stories. They have plenty of resources for short stories you can use with your class. This is also useful during weeks that you have middle school testing. You might only have a couple of students in the class and you don't want them to continue and the rest of the students be really behind. So on those weeks, I might pick a short story from here. It's separated by genre, so you can choose a type of story that will relate more to your class. It also has star ratings, page numbers, and maturity level ratings for each of the stories. So you can make sure that you choose a story that will be appropriate for your classroom. On weeks that we have the literary lesson, students will go over things like metaphor, foreshadowing, suspense, things like this that will come up in their story. A lot of times, there is a printout. The printout is pretty useful. There will be a couple of exercises. Again, you get this off the FTP. If you want to supplement that, you can also come up with an activity for the students to do. This is usually where I'll bring in a lot of maybe short video clips or short stories to connect to the different literary elements that we're talking about. readwritethink.org is an excellent resource here. Basically, if you type in foreshadowing lesson plan, hundreds of activities will come up that you can do with your classroom. And this is just kind of probably the part of the class where students will get the most interested if you put in that extra work and get them learning things. Also, the literary elements, you want to make sure that you do not ever skip this because these will come up on their quiz also. They need to know what these literary elements are, and this is something they'll need to know, again, at the end of this course. If they want to study somewhere else, it's important for them to know these things. In hour 2, this is the close reading and discussion hour. This is where you're going through the bulk of what they needed to do for homework, and you want to get your kids talking the most during this hour. There are lots of different ways that you can do this. In your program guide, there are several suggestions. As far as what I have up here, you want to make sure you can tie this into the literary lesson. If the students are discussing foreshadowing, you want to have them go back through the reading and find examples of foreshadowing. This is the perfect opportunity to show them that the skill that they learned is going to be useful. Also, I like to use the students as teachers during this part. I'll have my students search for something. Sometimes I'll break them up into different characters. I have them find everything about that character from our homework reading, and then I have them teach the class about that character. Using the students as teachers during this part gets them more involved. It puts the accountability on them, and it makes it more fun for them. You know, they have more fun when they are able to teach the other students about something. Next, I like to build this part of the story into homework. Sometimes I will assign particular things that I want them to look for in their homework. And then I bring this back during the close reading hour. Maybe I have them find quotes for suspense, for example. I had my readers or my students find quotes of things that scared them, things that seemed creepy in the story. This was when we were doing Gothic literature. They brought these examples back. During the close reading hour, we talked about how the author built that suspense in the story, and the students found it much more interesting that way. During this hour, you can also show videos, short clips. Obviously, you're not going to show them the entire movie of whatever story they're reading, but if there's a scene that you think would be well seen, on screen, you can show videos during this part. I always have my students compare and contrast when we do this. Why do you think they did it this way in the movie? Why couldn't they do it this way in the book? Or why couldn't they do it this way in the movie? And the students will get really into that. It's nice to see your students at this point start to develop that, oh, the movie is never as good as the book. I love it when my students say that, because then I know they're going to read the books rather than just see the movies for everything that we do. Lastly, during 2 terms, we have Shakespeare. This is the perfect opportunity to have your students act it out. Even if they're older, the students will connect to this. Having your students, up in the front playing Othello at one point, or being the witches in Macbeth, they're going to get more involved in the story, more interested in the story. So that's an excellent thing that you can do during the second hour of class. This is when a lot of people run into the problem of their students not reading. As a cure to this problem, not a cure-all, but a solution, you have to make sure that you set a standard in the beginning of the term. You'll have to work with your staff on this, work with your FM, decide with all of the master's teachers what your plan of action is going to be. If the students don't read, are you going to send them downstairs? Are you going to, how are you going to address it in your classroom? As far as my classroom, I don't like to send the students downstairs unless I think it's going to solve something. So usually, I have a talk with them in the beginning. We work it out. If there's a reading passage that is too long, it's during testing period, they tell me, this is impossible. We're not going to do this. And you might be able to gauge this also with your students. Occasionally, I don't do this all the time, but you can work out a system. I might have half of my students read 40 pages and the other students read 40 pages rather than having everybody read the full 80 pages. This way I'm ensured that they both will read, and when they come back into class in the second hour, we already have our second hour then. I know that they have to teach each other what's going to happen in those parts of the stories. This has worked out very well in my classes and gotten more of my students to understand the whole story, even though they might not have read a few pages of it. Lastly, I like to find out why they're not doing the reading. Ask them this question. If they're confused about something, you can build this into your annotations. Have them write questions, things they're confused about as they are doing their homework. In the third hour of class, you will have either a critical thinking exercise or in-class writing, like we discussed before. In-class writing will be on even weeks of the class. On weeks that you have the critical thinking exercise, you have the option of doing projects and activities. A lot of times they'll ask the students a question that will relate to their online writing. But again, this is the perfect opportunity to use Read, Write, Think. Come up with an activity related to the story that your students will be interested in. As far as the in-class writing, they have about the last 45 minutes of class to work on this. You can brainstorm with them in the beginning. What are they going to include in their writing? Go through the prompt with them, make sure they understand everything. As far as their actual writing, you do need to grade it. The grades go by strategy and substance. You don't want to be commenting on their grammar. Again, all of this is outlined in your program guide, but you want to make sure that you are commenting on why they chose certain things, certain events from the story, or why this detail doesn't exactly support their claim, why they could have chosen a different detail instead. On weeks that you do not have this, you will have online writing workshop, sometimes debate. This is when students that are signed up in your class will have online writing at home. You need to introduce this prompt to them in class. Now, if you somehow get off of the syllabus, maybe due to middle school testing or something that your branch has decided, you need to make sure that you let your students know if you change the prompt. They need to know what the prompt is. If you have a new prompt for them, they need to know it in class, because they will have the prompt written on the website, and your students need to know if the question that they're answering is a different one. In this case, you need to be prepared that some of your students might still answer the prompt that is listed online. Obviously, in that case, you still need to grade their writing. And some weeks you might have debate. This is pretty straightforward. They'll give you the guidelines for that. Some of your students might also be debate students. In that case, your job is pretty easy. You just need to facilitate whatever topic they've chosen for you. Lastly, we have the final project of the class. This is probably my favorite thing about teaching Master's Lit. The goal of the final project is to guide students to produce an essay in which they're using more than one of the stories that they've read in class. The big thing here is that you want them to be comparing and contrasting between the stories that they've read. You want to connect the overall theme of the class together in this part. There are several different ways of doing this. You want to make sure that you introduce the project very early in the course for them so that they know all of these things that they're learning are going to be connected. You also want to make sure you talk with your FM before you decide on any crazy thing that you're going to do in class. Also, you can talk with the other master's teachers. I know at our branch we like to do kind of a final project competition between all of the lit classes. So definitely, you can be creative, even if you have your students just doing the essay. There are several ways of coming at this, of approaching this. And you want it to be fun for your kids. You want them to want to do this project. But at the same time, you want to make sure that they are using all of the information that they've learned in class this term. So I have some examples here. First one, you can take the characters, themes, and settings from an assigned reading, and you can create a children's story. This definitely you need to discuss with your FM, decide if this is going to be okay for your students. At our branch, this ended up being a competition. We had children's stories based on, Lord of the Flies and Of Mice and Men. So we took these themes, but then brought them together, and it really forced the students to think about the stories from a different perspective. They really enjoyed this, and we bound all the stories together into kind of a children's book for Master's Lit. There are several other options. You could rewrite scenes in modern or future times. This is easy to do if you're sticking with the essay. They can look at two different stories, change the perspective, change the setting, and move it into something else. Also, rewriting scenes from different perspectives. You might have them look at a scene from Shakespeare, from Macbeth, and then adapt it from one of the characters from Othello instead. This, again, it's forcing them always to look at multiple stories that they've read in class and bring it together in that final project. I have another website here that's been helpful for me, Get 'em Reading. They have lists of final novel projects. Some of them are not so good. Some of them would be better for elementary school. But, it's up to you. Just decide early what you want to do with the final project. And lastly, as far as the online writing, you will have more information about this later. There is an email that you'll get with all of your guidelines, steps that you need to take for online writing. Just a few things to be aware of. Your first online writing has a different due date than the rest of them. This one, the students will have it due on a Tuesday. The instructor needs to grade it by Sunday. For all of the other ones, the students need to complete their essay by Sunday. The instructor has to grade it by Friday. This is always made very clear with emails, so make sure you're keeping in contact with your FM, you're receiving these emails if you need to. And for the online writing, again, it's 4 S checks. Remember, you're not grading their grammar, you are sticking to their strategy and their substance, making sure they're pulling the correct ideas. Also, you can print out some of these essays and bring them into class. This is perfect on the weeks that you have online writing workshop because the students get a chance to see what other students are submitting. And that is the end of the Master's Literary Projects workshop.